I'm Victoria Fleming, 29 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my family has looked right through me like I was made of glass. My older brother Christopher, everyone calls him Chris, he's the star of our family. Corporate finance manager, sharp suits, confident handshake, the kind of son parents brag about at dinner parties. Me? I'm the one who kept everything running behind the scenes, the one who poured every ounce of energy into making sure our family stayed afloat. The one who gave up everything I'd worked for just to keep them happy. But no matter what I did, no matter how many late nights I pulled or how many sacrifices I made, their eyes would glaze over when I spoke. They'd nod politely and then turn back to Chris, asking about his latest promotion or his new car. I spent years believing that if I just worked harder, if I just proved myself one more time, they'd finally see me as more than background noise. I was wrong about that. Dead wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The truth hit me like a freight train the night before Chris's wedding. We were sitting around the dining table in our family home in Columbus, that old colonial and German village with the creaky hardwood floors, and the smell of my mother's garlic bread always hanging in the air. I'd spent 3 months planning every detail of his wedding to Melissa, his fiancée who worked in marketing and had opinions about everything. I'd invested $12,000 of my own savings, money I'd scraped together from freelance graphic design projects, to make sure their day would be perfect. I coordinated with vendors, designed custom invitations, managed the timeline, handled the deposits. I did everything they asked and more. And that night, when I told Chris I couldn't afford the imported Italian wines he suddenly decided he needed, wines that cost $800 per bottle, he looked at me with such disgust you'd think I'd spit in his face. My mother, Patricia, she goes by Trish, set down her wine glass with a sharp clink against the table. My father Robert just stared at his plate like he always does when conflict bubbles up. And then Trish said the words that would change everything. She said the greatest gift I could give my brother on his wedding day would be to disappear from this family completely. Just like that. Disappear. As if I was some kind of stain they'd been trying to scrub out for years. Chris nodded in agreement. Melissa stayed quiet but didn't defend me. And my father, well, he just kept eating his pasta like nothing had happened. The room went cold. My hands started shaking. But I didn't cry. I didn't beg them to take it back. I stood up, grabbed my purse and my keys, and I walked out of that house. The door closed behind me with a finality that felt like the end of a chapter I'd been trapped in for far too long. Growing up in Columbus, I was always the creative one in a family that valued structure and prestige. Chris went to business school, got his finance degree, climbed the corporate ladder at a downtown firm that managed portfolios for wealthy clients. He had the corner office, the expense account, the life our parents had always envisioned for their children. I went to art school. I studied graphic design because I loved the idea of creating visual stories, of helping small businesses find their identity through color and typography and clever layouts. My parents tolerated it. They'd introduce Chris as their son, the finance manager, and me as their daughter who does computer stuff. That's how they'd phrase it. Computer stuff. Like I was just messing around with clip art instead of building actual brands for actual businesses. I started freelancing right out of college, taking on projects for local cafes, boutiques, startups that needed logos and websites but couldn't afford big agencies. The work was inconsistent at first. Some months I'd make $3,000, other months barely $1,000. But I loved it. I loved meeting with clients, understanding their vision, translating their ideas into something tangible. I built a portfolio slowly, project by project, and after about 4 years I landed my biggest opportunity. Cascade Hospitality Group, a regional hotel chain expanding through the Midwest, wanted to rebrand. They needed new logos, new marketing materials, new everything. The contract was worth $50,000, more money than I'd ever made on a single project. It would have set me up for a year, maybe more. It would have proven to my parents that I wasn't just playing around, that my career was legitimate. But then Fleming's Corner Bistro started falling apart. The restaurant had been my parents' dream. An Italian-American place in German Village that served homemade pasta and Sunday brunch to neighborhood regulars. They'd opened it 15 years ago with their life savings, and for a while it did well. But competition increased, newer restaurants with trendier menus moved into the area, and my parents didn't know how to adapt. They didn't understand social media or online reviews or modern marketing. Their customer base aged out, and younger diners didn't even know the restaurant existed. By the time I was 26, the place was hemorrhaging money. Vendors stopped delivering because invoices went unpaid. The dining room sat half empty most nights. My parents were drowning in debt, something like $80,000 spread across credit cards and business loans. Trish called me one afternoon, her voice cracking with desperation. She said they were going to lose everything, that the bank was threatening foreclosure on the restaurant property, that they didn't know what to do. My father got on the line, and I'd never heard him sound so defeated. He admitted they'd made mistakes, that they were in over their heads, that they needed help. And of course I said yes. Of course I dropped everything. I called the rep at Cascade Hospitality Group and told them I couldn't take the contract, made up some excuse about a family emergency. They were disappointed but professional about it. I watched that $50,000 opportunity dissolve, and I threw myself into saving the restaurant. I spent the next 6 months working around the clock. I redesigned the entire brand identity for Fleming's Corner Bistro. New logo, new menu design, new color scheme, new everything. I made it feel modern but still warm and family-oriented. The kind of place where you'd want to bring your kids or celebrate an anniversary. I built them a website from scratch, set up their social media accounts, started posting daily content to build engagement. I created Facebook ads targeting local neighborhoods, designed flyers and distributed them to nearby businesses, reached out to food bloggers for reviews. I negotiated with suppliers to restructure payment plans, convinced some of them to give us another chance. I even worked shifts in the restaurant itself, hostessing and bussing tables when they were short-staffed, anything to keep the place running. The results were undeniable. Within 3 months, foot traffic doubled. Reservations started coming in through the website. Younger customers discovered us through Instagram, posting photos of our pasta dishes and tagging the restaurant. Revenue climbed steadily. We started paying down the debt, first the most urgent bills, then the larger loans. The vendors came back. The dining room filled up on weekends. I tracked every metric, showed my parents the analytics, explained how each piece of the strategy worked together. I thought they'd be grateful. I thought they'd finally acknowledge what I'd done. I thought maybe, just maybe, this would be the moment they saw me as capable, as valuable, as someone worth their pride. Instead, they handed control of the restaurant to Chris. It happened at a family meeting one Sunday evening, about 8 months after I'd started the turnaround. We gathered in the restaurant after closing, sitting at one of the corner booths. My mother had made coffee, and there was a tray of biscotti on the table. I remember thinking it felt formal, like they were about to announce something important. And they were. Trish folded her hands and smiled at Chris with this glowing expression, the kind of look she'd never once directed at me. She said they'd been talking, that the restaurant was doing so much better now, and that they wanted to make sure it stayed successful long term. She said Chris had the business acumen, the financial expertise, the leadership skills to run the place properly. She said it like it was obvious, like there was no other logical choice. My father nodded along, sipping his coffee. He said Chris would take over as managing partner, that he'd oversee operations and finances, that it was the smart move for the family. Chris leaned back in the booth, already comfortable in his new role, and he looked at me with this patronizing smile. He said I'd done a decent job getting things started, that the new branding was fine, that he appreciated the effort. Decent. Fine. Appreciated. Those were the words he used to describe 6 months of my life. 6 months where I'd sat. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sacrificed my biggest career opportunity, worked 80-hour weeks, poured my skills and energy into saving their business. And now he was going to waltz in and take credit for all of it. I sat there stunned, the coffee mug warm in my hands, trying to process what was happening. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the table. I wanted to demand that they explain how this made any sense, how they could look me in the eye and pretend I hadn't just saved their entire livelihood. But I didn't. I stayed quiet. I nodded. I said congratulations to Chris. I hugged my mother when she stood up to clear the dishes. I shook my father's hand. I played the part of the supportive sister, the dutiful daughter, because that's what I'd always done. That's what they expected. And some broken part of me still believed that if I kept being good, kept being helpful, kept sacrificing, they'd eventually reward me with the recognition I craved. Chris started making changes almost immediately. He'd come into the restaurant in his work clothes, still wearing his tie from the office, and he'd walk around like he owned the place, which technically he now did. He'd critique the menu, suggest price increases, talk about profit margins and overhead costs. He'd take credit for the social media strategy I'd built, telling customers and staff that he'd modernized the marketing approach. My parents would beam at him, praising his business savvy. Meanwhile, I was still doing most of the actual work. I managed the Instagram account, responded to online reviews, coordinated with the graphic designer I'd hired for seasonal promotions. I updated the website, tracked reservation trends, maintained relationships with food bloggers who'd become regular supporters. But whenever someone complimented the restaurant's turnaround, Chris would accept the praise without mentioning my name. Ethan Rodriguez, my best friend since college, could see what was happening. Ethan and I met in a required business course during undergrad, bonded over our mutual hatred of 8 a.m. lectures and our love of bad coffee. He went into software development, worked remotely for a tech company in California, and we'd stayed close over the years. He was one of the few people who understood my family dynamics, who'd witnessed firsthand how they treated me. We'd meet up at this coffee shop downtown, a place called Roosevelt's with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls, and I'd vent about the latest dismissal or slight. Ethan would listen, his laptop open in front of him but his attention fully on me, and he'd shake his head in disbelief. One afternoon, about a year after Chris took over the restaurant, Ethan and I sat in our usual corner booth. I was telling him about how Chris had presented my quarterly marketing report to our parents as if he'd compiled it himself, how they'd praised his attention to detail. Ethan set down his coffee mug harder than necessary. He said I was killing myself for people who didn't value me, that I needed to stop waiting for them to change, that they'd already shown me exactly who they were. I brushed it off. I made excuses. I said families were complicated, that I just needed to be patient, that eventually they'd realize how much I contributed. Ethan looked at me with frustration and something like sadness. He said I deserved better, that I was worth more than their scraps of approval. His words stuck with me, even though I wasn't ready to accept them yet. I kept working at the restaurant, kept managing the marketing, kept hoping. Chris would breeze through, make superficial suggestions, and leave. My parents would thank him for checking in. I'd be there 5 days a week, sometimes 6, handling actual problems, putting out actual fires, and they'd barely acknowledge my presence. Customers would compliment the branding, the online presence, the whole vibe of the place, and Chris would smile and say thank you like he'd done it all himself. I told myself this was temporary, that I was building towards something, that my dedication would pay off. But deep down, in a place I didn't want to examine too closely, I knew Ethan was right. I knew I was waiting for something that was never going to come. Then Chris got engaged to Melissa. She was nice enough, polished and professional, worked in marketing for a healthcare company downtown. They'd been dating for 2 years, and the engagement wasn't a surprise. What was a surprise was how quickly my family started planning the wedding, and how quickly I got roped into making it happen. It started casually. Trish mentioned over dinner that they were thinking about a fall wedding, something elegant, maybe at the Ivory Room at Scioto Reserve, a upscale venue on the north side of Columbus. She said it would be wonderful if I could help with some of the planning, given my design background and attention to detail. Just help with some things, she said. Nothing too demanding. Within 2 weeks, I was essentially the unpaid wedding planner. Melissa had opinions about everything but no time to execute them. Chris was too busy with work. My parents were footing part of the bill, but had no idea how to coordinate vendors or timelines. So it fell to me. I started calling venues, comparing packages, negotiating rates. I met with caterers, tasted sample menus, reviewed contracts. I researched florists, looked at portfolios, got quotes for centerpieces and bouquets. I designed the invitations myself, custom illustrations with their initials intertwined, printed on heavy cardstock with gold foil accents. I created a wedding website with RSVP functionality and a gift registry. I managed the guest list, tracked responses, handled seating arrangements, and I paid for half of it. Chris and Melissa set a budget of $24,000, and they expected my parents to cover most of it. But my parents, despite the restaurant doing well now, claimed they couldn't afford the full amount. They said it wouldn't be fair to burden them with the entire cost, that weddings were expensive, that everyone should contribute. Chris looked at me expectantly. He said it would mean a lot if I could help out financially, that we were family, that this was his big day. Melissa smiled hopefully. My parents nodded encouragingly. And like an idiot, I said yes. I transferred $12,000 from my savings account, money I'd earned from freelance projects, money I'd been saving for a down payment on a condo, or maybe a sabbatical to focus on my own creative work. Gone. Just like that. Poured into Chris's wedding. I told myself it would be worth it. I told myself this was my chance to show them what I could do, to create something beautiful and memorable, to prove my value once and for all. I threw myself into the planning with the same intensity I'd brought to saving the restaurant. I worked late into the night, researching trends, creating mood boards, coordinating with vendors. I chose a menu that balanced elegance with their Italian heritage, starting with bruschetta and antipasto, moving to a pasta course, then herb-crusted chicken and grilled salmon for the mains, finishing with tiramisu and cannoli for dessert. I found a local jazz quartet that played standards and contemporary covers, perfect for cocktail hour and dinner. I selected seasonal flowers, dahlias and roses in burgundy and cream, arranged in low centerpieces so guests could see across the tables. Every decision was thoughtful. Every detail was intentional. I wanted it to be perfect. Not because I cared about impressing Chris and Melissa, but because I needed my family to see me. I needed them to acknowledge that I was capable, that I had skills, that I mattered. I kept thinking about that moment at the reception when my parents would pull me aside and thank me, really thank me, for making their son's wedding so beautiful. I imagined Chris admitting that he couldn't have done it without me, Melissa hugging me and calling me the best sister-in-law. I imagined, for once in my life, being the center of their gratitude instead of the shadow they barely noticed. But Chris had other ideas about what his wedding should look like. About 6 weeks before the wedding, Chris started changing his mind about everything. It began with small tweaks, requests that seemed reasonable on the surface but chipped away at the carefully constructed budget I'd built. He called me on a Tuesday morning, while I was working on a logo design for a local bakery client. He didn't ask if I was busy, just launched into what he wanted. He said he'd been thinking about the music, that a jazz quartet was nice but maybe a little boring, that he wanted something with more presence. He'd heard about this opera singer from Cleveland, a soprano who performed at corporate events and high-end weddings, and he thought it would be incredible to have her perform during the ceremony and cocktail hour. He said it casually, like he was suggesting we swap out napkin colors. I pulled up my budget spreadsheet and looked at the numbers. The jazz quartet was costing us $1,800 for 5 hours. I'd already paid the deposit. I asked Chris how much the opera singer would cost. He said he wasn't sure, probably around $4,000 or $5,000, but it would be worth it because their guests would talk about it for years. $4,000 or $5,000. That was nearly half of what I'd personally contributed to the wedding. I explained this to him, keeping my voice level, trying to be diplomatic. I said we'd already locked in the quartet, that they were professionals with great reviews, that adding an opera singer would blow past our budget. Chris sighed like I was being difficult. He said I was always so focused on the money, that this was supposed to be a celebration, that he didn't understand why I had to nickel and dime everything. I felt my jaw tighten, but I stayed calm. I reminded him that I'd contributed $12,000 of my own money, that our parents had contributed the other $12,000, that we'd agreed on a budget for a reason. He said maybe we could cut costs somewhere else, that surely there was room to adjust. I asked where he suggested we cut. Flowers? Food? Photography? Each of those areas was already optimized, vendors selected for quality at reasonable prices. He didn't have an answer, just said I should figure it out. That's what I was good at, making things work. Then he hung up. No goodbye, no thank you for all the work I'd already done, just a click and dial tone. 2 days later, Melissa texted me with a screenshot from a wedding magazine. It showed an elaborate tablescape with towering centerpieces made from rare imported orchids, the kind you don't find at regular florists. The flowers were stunning. I'll admit that. These incredible blooms in shades of purple and white with intricate patterns on the petals. Melissa's message said she'd fallen in love with these orchids, that she knew our current flower plan was nice, but these would make the reception unforgettable, that she hoped we could make it happen. She added a smiley face emoji like that would soften the ask. I called the florist I'd been working with, a woman named Angela who ran a shop in German Village and had been incredibly helpful throughout the planning process. I described the orchids from the photo and asked if she could source them. Angela was quiet for a moment, then said those particular orchids were Paphiopedilum rothschildianum, extremely rare and expensive, typically flown in from specialty growers in Florida or even international sources. She said for the quantity we'd need to decorate 20 tables, we'd be looking at somewhere between $8,000 and $10,000 just for the flowers, not including labor for arranging them. $8,000 to $10,000. For flowers. That was almost the entire floral budget I'd allocated for ceremony flowers, centerpieces, bouquets and boutonnieres combined. I thanked Angela and told her I'd get back to her. Then I called Melissa. I explained the cost, tried to frame it gently, suggested we could incorporate a few of the orchids as accents while keeping the dahlias and roses as the main flowers. Melissa's enthusiasm deflated immediately. She said she didn't want just a few that would look cheap and half-hearted, that if we were going to do it we should commit fully. I asked if she and Chris were willing to contribute additional funds to cover the upgrade. She got quiet, then said she thought the budget we'd set should be enough to cover what they wanted, that she didn't understand why everything had to be such a negotiation. I felt something crack inside my chest, but I kept my voice professional. I said I'd see what I could do. That evening I sat at my kitchen table in my apartment, a small one-bedroom place in Victoria Village, and I recalculated everything. I made spreadsheets with different scenarios. If we downgraded the catering, we could save maybe $2,000. If we cut the cocktail hour appetizers and just served wine and beer instead of a full bar, another $1,000. If we eliminated the dessert table and just did wedding cake, $700. But even with all those cuts, we'd still be short several $1,000s for the orchids and the opera singer. And honestly, the wedding would suffer. The food was already modest by upscale wedding standards. The bar was already limited. Making more cuts would make the whole event feel cheap, and I knew my family would blame me for that. Chris called me the next morning before I'd even finished my coffee. He'd been talking to a colleague at work who'd recently gotten married, and this colleague had hired a celebrity chef from Cincinnati to cater his reception. The chef had a restaurant that had been featured on some Food Network show, and apparently the food was incredible, worth every penny. Chris wanted that chef for his wedding. He said the current catering menu was fine but unremarkable, that their wedding deserved something special, something people would remember. I asked how much the celebrity chef would cost. Chris said around $15,000 for 150 guests, maybe a bit more depending on the menu they selected. $15,000. Our entire catering budget was $6,000. I'd already paid the deposit to the caterer we'd selected, a reputable Italian place that did beautiful work. I told Chris this. I explained that we'd signed a contract, that breaking it would mean losing our deposit, that hiring a different caterer at this stage would be nearly impossible anyway given the timeline, and that even if we could make it work, we didn't have an extra $9,000 sitting around. Chris's voice went cold. He said I was being stubborn and unimaginative, that I was more concerned with protecting my little spreadsheets than with making his wedding special. He said if I really cared about him, about the family, I'd find a way to make it happen. I felt anger rising in my throat like bile, but I swallowed it down. I said I cared very much, that I'd been working on this wedding for months, that I'd invested a significant amount of my own money and time, but that I couldn't conjure funds that didn't exist. Chris scoffed. He said I always had an excuse, that I never went above and beyond, that maybe he should just handle the rest of the planning himself since I clearly wasn't up to the task. I wanted to tell him to go ahead, to take over, to see how impossible his demands were. But I didn't. I said I'd look into options and we'd talk later. He hung up without responding. That weekend, my parents invited me over for Sunday dinner. This was a regular tradition in our family, something we'd done for years. Usually it was pleasant enough. We'd eat Trish's cooking, talk about work and current events, maybe watch a movie afterward. But that night felt different from the moment I walked in. The house smelled like roasted garlic and tomato sauce, Trish's signature dishes, but the atmosphere was tense. Chris and Melissa were already there, sitting at the dining room table with glasses of wine. My father Robert was in his usual spot at the head of the table, reading something on his tablet. Trish was in the kitchen finishing up the food. I set down the bottle of wine I'd brought as a contribution and took my seat. Chris barely acknowledged me, didn't look up from his phone. Melissa gave me a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Trish came out carrying a platter of chicken parmesan and a bowl of pasta, and we started serving ourselves. The first few minutes were quiet, just the sound of silverware on plates and people chewing. Then Chris set down his fork and looked at me directly. He said he wanted to talk about the wedding. He said he'd been discussing things with Melissa, and they'd realized that their vision for the day wasn't matching up with what I'd been planning. He said they appreciated my efforts, but they needed someone who understood luxury events, someone who could execute at a higher level. My father looked up from his plate. Trish stopped eating, her attention fully on Chris. I felt my stomach drop, but I kept my expression neutral. I asked what specifically they were concerned about. Melissa spoke up, her voice soft but pointed. She said the vendors I'd selected were adequate but not exceptional, that when they looked at other weddings in their social circle, those events had a level of sophistication and grandeur that ours was lacking. She said she didn't want to seem ungrateful, but she'd always dreamed of a fairy tale wedding, and what we had planned felt more like a nice dinner party. Chris nodded in agreement. He said they'd been looking at upgrading several elements: the flowers, the entertainment, the catering, and they needed me to make those upgrades happen. I took a breath and explained again that we'd set a budget, that we'd already maxed it out, that the upgrades they wanted would cost tens of thousands of dollars we didn't have. I looked at my parents, hoping they'd back me up, hoping they'd tell Chris he was being unreasonable. Trish set down her wine glass and folded her hands. She said Chris only gets married once, that this was a milestone moment for the family, that surely we could find a way to make his dreams come true. Robert nodded slowly. He said weddings were important, that you couldn't put a price on memories, that I should try to be more flexible. I felt like I'd been slapped. Flexible. I'd been nothing but flexible. I'd rearranged my entire work schedule to accommodate vendor meetings. I'd spent countless hours researching and planning. I drained half my savings. And now they were telling me to be more flexible, as if I was the problem, as if I was the one being difficult. I asked point blank if they were willing to contribute more money to cover the upgrades Chris wanted. Trish and Robert exchanged a look. Trish said they'd already contributed what they could, that their finances were stretched thin, that maybe I could pull from my business accounts or take out a small loan. A loan. They wanted me to go into debt for Chris's wedding. I looked at Chris, waiting for him to say something, to acknowledge that his demands were excessive. Instead, he shrugged and said if I wasn't willing to make the investment, maybe I wasn't as committed to the family as I claimed to be. Those words hung in the air. Not as committed to the family. After everything I'd done for them, for the restaurant, for this wedding, he had the audacity to question my commitment. I put down my fork, my appetite completely gone. I said I'd contributed everything I could reasonably give, that I'd been working tirelessly to make their wedding beautiful, that the budget we'd agreed on was already generous and well planned. Chris rolled his eyes. He said I always made everything about money, that I was too practical and not enough of a dreamer. Melissa added quietly that she'd expected more from a sister-in-law, that in her family everyone went all out for weddings, that it was just what you did when you loved someone. Trish reached over and patted Chris's hand sympathetically. She said it was hard when family members didn't share the same values, that some people were just naturally more generous than others. The implication was clear. I was the selfish one. I was the one who wasn't generous enough. My father, ever the peacemaker in the most passive way possible, suggested we all take a breath and revisit the conversation when emotions weren't running so high. But his tone made it clear he sided with Chris. I excused myself from the table, said I wasn't feeling well, grabbed my purse and left. No one tried to stop me. No one followed me out. I sat in my car in their driveway for a full 10 minutes, gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened. They'd turned the entire situation around, made me the villain in a story where I was the only one actually trying to hold things together. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing through every conversation, every sacrifice, every moment where I'd bent over backward to please them. Over the next 2 weeks, the demands continued. Chris wanted custom ice sculptures for the reception, elaborate designs of swans or their initials, something that would photograph well. He found a company in Cleveland that specialized in ice art, sent me their portfolio with a note that said, "This is what I'm talking about, this is the level we need." I looked up their pricing. $3,000 minimum for the pieces he wanted. I didn't even bother calling him to discuss it. I just sent back a message saying it was outside our budget. He responded with an angry phone call, accusing me of sabotaging his wedding, saying I was intentionally making things difficult because I was jealous of his success. Jealous? That word stung more than I expected. I wasn't jealous of Chris. I was exhausted by him. Exhausted by the constant demands, the lack of appreciation, the way he treated me like hired help instead of his sister. But I didn't say any of that. I just listened to him vent, waited for him to run out of steam, and then calmly repeated that we didn't have the money for ice sculptures. He said fine, he'd figure it out himself, and hung up. Melissa started sending me Pinterest boards daily, sometimes multiple times a day, each one filled with elaborate wedding details that bore no resemblance to what we'd planned. Luxury lounges with velvet furniture for the cocktail hour, string quartets and harpists, multi-tier cakes decorated with edible gold leaf, champagne towers, photo booths with custom backdrops. Each pin came with a little note, "Wouldn't this be amazing?" or "We should totally do this." I stopped responding after the first few. There was no point. We couldn't afford any of it, and explaining that over and over again was wearing me down. Ethan noticed the toll it was taking. We met for lunch at a sandwich shop near his apartment, and I must have looked awful because his first words were, "You okay?" I gave him the abbreviated version of what had been happening, the escalating demands, the family dinner where they basically called me selfish, Chris's accusations of jealousy. Ethan listened quietly, eating his sandwich, and when I finished he shook his head slowly. He said I needed to walk away. Just stop. Let Chris plan his own wedding, let my parents deal with the fallout, let the whole thing implode if that's what it took. He said I was destroying myself trying to meet impossible expectations, that no amount of effort would ever be enough for them, that they'd already decided I was the problem and nothing I did would change their minds. I told him I couldn't just quit, that I'd already invested so much, that maybe if I could just get through the wedding everything would settle down. Ethan looked at me with frustration and sadness mixed together. He said I was making excuses, that I was clinging to hope that didn't exist. I knew he was right. Deep down, in a place I didn't want to examine, I knew. But I wasn't ready to accept it yet. I still believed that if I could pull off this wedding, if I could somehow make it beautiful despite all the obstacles, my family would finally see me. They'd finally acknowledge everything I'd done. They'd finally value me the way they valued Chris. So I kept going. I kept calling vendors, kept adjusting plans, kept trying to find compromises that would satisfy Chris's champagne tastes on our beer budget. The florist Angela called me with an idea. She said she'd been thinking about the orchid situation, and while she couldn't get the rare imported ones Melissa wanted, she could source some beautiful domestic orchids that would still make a statement. They wouldn't be the exact same species, but they'd be stunning. And she could mix them with the roses and dahlias we'd already selected to create something unique. The cost would be about $4,000 total for all the flowers, $2,000 more than our original budget but far less than the imported orchids. I thought this was a brilliant compromise, exactly the kind of creative solution that could make everyone happy. I called Melissa to tell her about it. I explained Angela's idea, described how the arrangements would look, emphasized that while they weren't the exact flowers from the magazine, they'd still be gorgeous and memorable. Melissa was silent for a long moment. Then she said she didn't want a compromise, that she'd already told her friends and family about the rare orchids, that she'd built up this image in her mind of how the reception would look, and she didn't want to settle for less. I felt my patience finally starting to crack. I asked her directly if she and Chris were going to contribute additional money to make that happen. She said they shouldn't have to, that the budget we'd set should have been enough if I'd planned better. If I'd planned better. As if the problem was my competence and not their unrealistic expectations. I told her I'd done everything I could with the resources available, that I'd been working on this wedding for months without any help from either of them, and that if they wanted imported orchids they needed to either pay for them or accept a beautiful alternative. Melissa's voice went cold. She said she'd talked to Chris about getting someone else to handle the flowers, that clearly I wasn't capable of executing their vision. Then she hung up. I sat on my couch staring at my phone, feeling something shift inside me. It wasn't anger exactly, though there was plenty of that. It was more like clarity, a sudden sharp understanding that no matter what I did, it would never be enough. They would keep asking for more, keep criticizing, keep treating me like an incompetent employee, rather than a family member who'd sacrificed enormously to make their day special. And the worst part was that my parents would support them in it, would side with Chris and Melissa every single time, because that's what they'd always done. Chris called me that evening. He said Melissa had told him about our conversation, that he was disappointed in my attitude, that I'd been defensive and unhelpful. He said they'd decided to bring in a professional wedding planner to take over the remaining details, someone who actually knew what they were doing. I asked if they were planning to reimburse me for the $12,000 I'd already spent. Chris actually laughed and said that money was a gift, that you don't ask for gifts back, that I should be happy to contribute to my brother's happiness. Something inside me snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. I told Chris that if they wanted to bring in another planner, that was fine, but I was done. I said I'd handled the deposits and contracts, that the new planner could contact me for all the vendor information, but I wouldn't be doing any more work on the wedding. Chris's tone shifted immediately. He said I was being childish, that I couldn't just abandon the wedding a month before the date, that the family was counting on me. I repeated that I was done, my voice steady and calm. Then I ended the call. Within an hour, Trish was calling me. She was upset, her voice high and strained. She said Chris had told her I'd quit the wedding, that I'd left them in the lurch, that this was so unlike me. She asked what had happened, what had changed, why I was suddenly being so difficult. I explained, trying to keep my composure, that I'd been working on the wedding for months, that I'd contributed a substantial amount of money, that Chris and Melissa kept demanding expensive upgrades we couldn't afford, and that when I couldn't deliver the impossible, they treated me like I was incompetent. Trish listened, but I could tell she wasn't really hearing me. She said Chris was under a lot of stress, that planning a wedding was hard on everyone, that I needed to be more understanding. She said this was his special day, that he only gets married once, that family members make sacrifices for each other. I asked her why I was the only one expected to make sacrifices, why Chris never had to compromise or adjust his expectations, why everything always fell on me. Trish got quiet. Then she said I was being selfish, that this wasn't about me, that I needed to think about what was best for the family. I told her I'd been thinking about what was best for the family my entire adult life, and it had gotten me nowhere. She said she didn't understand where this attitude was coming from, that I needed to reconsider my priorities. I hung up without saying goodbye. My hands were shaking, but I felt oddly calm. I'd finally said some of what I'd been holding in for years. It didn't matter that she didn't listen, didn't matter that she couldn't see my perspective. I'd said it. That was something. Robert called next. His approach different from Trish's. He was measured, diplomatic, trying to smooth things over like he always did. He said he understood I was frustrated, that wedding planning was stressful, that everyone's emotions were running high. He said maybe we could all sit down together, have a calm conversation, work through the issues like adults. I told him there was nothing to work through, that I'd done everything I could reasonably do, and that Chris and Melissa's expectations had become unreasonable and insulting. Robert sighed. He said I was putting him in a difficult position, that Chris was upset, that Trish was worried, that the wedding was in jeopardy because of my decision to step back. Because of my decision. Not because of Chris's impossible demands. Not because of Melissa's refusal to compromise. Not because my parents had enabled this behavior and taken sides against me at every turn. No, it was my decision that was the problem. I told Robert the first wasn't the one who put anyone in a difficult position, that I'd been trying to help and had been treated like garbage for my efforts, and that I was no longer willing to subject myself to that treatment. He said I was being dramatic, that families work through disagreements, that I needed to be the bigger person. I asked him why I always had to be the bigger person, why Chris never had to be, why I was the one expected to bend and compromise and sacrifice while everyone else just took. Robert didn't have an answer for that. He said we'd talk more later and hung up. I turned off my phone after that. I couldn't handle any more calls, any more guilt trips, any more attempts to manipulate me back into compliance. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my couch in the quiet of my apartment. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. Yes, there would be consequences. Yes, my family would be angry. But I'd finally drawn a line, finally said no, finally chosen myself over their endless demands. It felt terrifying and liberating at the same time. The next few days were tense. I kept my phone off except to check for work messages from actual clients. I focused on my freelance projects, threw myself into designing a logo for a local coffee roaster, worked on a website refresh for a boutique in Short North. The creative work felt good. reminded me that I had skills and value outside of my family's narrow view of me. Ethan texted me asking if I was okay, and I called him from my laptop using Wi-Fi so I wouldn't have to turn on my phone. I told him what had happened, how I'd finally quit the wedding planning. He was quiet for a moment, then said he was proud of me, that it took guts to set that boundary, that he knew how hard it must have been. About a week before the wedding, I finally turned my phone back on. The voicemails and texts were overwhelming. Dozens of messages from Chris, from Trish, from Robert, even a few from Melissa. Most of them were variations on the same theme. How could I do this to them? The wedding was falling apart. The new planner they'd hired was charging an emergency rush fee and couldn't fix everything. Vendors were confused about who was in charge. Details were being missed. It was all my fault for abandoning them. Chris's messages were particularly nasty. He called me selfish, vindictive, jealous, bitter. He said I'd never been supportive of his relationship with Melissa, that I'd always resented his success, that this was my way of trying to ruin his happiness. I deleted most of the messages without listening to them fully. There was one from Angela the florist, asking me to call her when I had a chance because there was some confusion about the flower order. I called her back and she explained the situation gently. The new wedding planner Chris had hired wanted to make changes to the arrangements, but Angela still had my deposit and contract and wasn't sure how to proceed. I told her to refund my deposit, that I was no longer involved with the wedding, and that she should work directly with the new planner going forward. Angela was understanding, said she was sorry things had gotten complicated, and promised to process the refund quickly. That refund was $1,200, a fraction of what I'd spent on the wedding overall, but it felt significant. It felt like taking back a piece of myself. Over the next few days, I contacted every vendor I'd put deposits with and requested refunds where possible. The caterer kept their deposit since we were inside the cancellation window, but the band refunded half of what I'd paid. The photographer, a freelancer I'd worked with before, refunded me in full as a professional courtesy. The venue itself had been paid for by my parents, so I couldn't touch that, but I clawed back about $4,000 total. It wasn't the full $12,000 I'd invested, but it was something. Then came the invitation to the final family dinner before the wedding. Trish called from Robert's phone, probably because she knew I wouldn't answer if I saw her name. She said they needed to have a family meeting, that there were things we needed to discuss before the wedding, that it was important everyone was on the same page. She sounded tired, strained, not her usual forceful self. Against my better judgment, I agreed to come. Maybe part of me still hoped we could find some kind of resolution. Maybe part of me wanted to hear them actually acknowledge what they'd put me through. Or maybe I was just curious to see how this would all play out. I drove to their house in German Village on a Thursday evening, the night before the rehearsal dinner. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across their front yard. I sat in my car for a minute before going in, trying to prepare myself mentally for whatever was about to happen. The house looked the same as always, warm light glowing through the windows, the porch light on, Trish's flower boxes overflowing with late summer blooms. It looked welcoming and safe, which felt like a cruel irony given how unwelcome and unsafe I'd felt in that house for years. I walked in without knocking, the way I always had. Family privilege. The smell of roasted chicken and garlic hit me immediately. Trish's cooking filling the house with familiar comfort smells that felt at odds with the tension I knew was waiting inside. Chris and Melissa were already there, sitting at the dining room table with glasses of red wine. Robert was in his usual chair, reading something on his tablet. Trish emerged from the kitchen carrying a basket of bread, her face lighting up when she saw me, like everything was normal, like the past few weeks hadn't happened. She said she was glad I came, that she'd made my favorite, her lemon chicken with roasted potatoes. I didn't tell her that hadn't been my favorite for years, that my tastes had changed, that she'd never bothered to ask. I just took my seat at the table, the same seat I'd sat in for countless family dinners, and waited for whatever was coming. The food was served, plates passed around, wine poured. For a few minutes it was almost normal, just the sounds of eating and polite requests to pass the salt or more bread. Then Chris set down his fork and the room went quiet. He said we needed to talk about the wedding. He said the past few weeks had been incredibly stressful, that my decision to step back from planning had created chaos, that the new planner had done her best but couldn't undo all the damage I'd caused by quitting. I felt my jaw tighten, but I stayed quiet, curious to see where this was going. Chris continued. He said despite everything, despite how I'd let them down, they still wanted me at the wedding. He said family was family, that they were willing to forgive me if I was willing to apologize and commit to being supportive on the day itself. Forgive me? Apologize? For what exactly? For refusing to go into debt to fund his fantasy wedding. For setting a boundary after months of being treated like garbage. I looked around the table. Melissa was studying her plate, avoiding eye contact. Robert was nodding along with Chris's words. Trish was watching me expectantly, waiting for me to fall in line like I always had. And something inside me, that last thread of hope or delusion or whatever had kept me tied to this family, finally snapped clean through. I looked at Chris across the table, his expression smug and self-satisfied, waiting for me to crumble and apologize like he clearly expected. Melissa was still avoiding my gaze, picking at her chicken with her fork. My mother had her hands folded, that look on her face that said she was being patient, but her patience was wearing thin. My father sat there like a judge waiting to deliver a verdict. And I realized in that moment that nothing I said would matter to them. No explanation would penetrate their conviction that I was the problem. No amount of evidence about what I'd sacrificed would change their minds. They'd already decided who I was in their story, and that person was the selfish daughter who'd abandoned her brother when he needed her most. I set down my fork carefully, making sure it didn't clatter against the plate. I took a sip of water to wet my throat. Then I asked Chris a simple question. I asked him what exactly he thought I should apologize for. He blinked like the answer was obvious. He said for quitting, for leaving them scrambling, for making his wedding planning a nightmare when it should have been a joyful experience. I nodded slowly, letting his words hang in the air. Then I asked him if he remembered how much money I'd contributed to his wedding. He waved his hand dismissively and said that was a gift, that I'd offered it freely, that he didn't see how that was relevant. I asked if he remembered who'd spent 3 months coordinating with vendors, designing invitations, managing the guest list, handling every single detail while he did nothing but add expensive demands. He said I'd volunteered to help, that nobody forced me. I asked if he remembered the $50,000 contract I'd walked away from to save the family restaurant, or the year I'd spent working 80-hour weeks to rebuild the business from the ground up only to watch him take credit for it. Chris's face hardened. He said I was being dramatic, that I'd done what any family member would do, that I didn't get special recognition for basic support. Basic support. I'd gutted my career, drained my savings, sacrificed my time and energy, and he called it basic support. I looked at my mother and asked her if she remembered begging me to help save the restaurant, promising that the family would never forget what I'd done. Trish shifted uncomfortably. She said that was different, that the restaurant was a family matter, that we'd all benefited from its success. I pointed out that Chris had benefited most of all, getting handed control of a thriving business he'd done nothing to save. Robert cleared his throat and said we were getting off topic, that this dinner was supposed to be about moving forward, not rehashing the past. Moving forward. They wanted to move forward without ever acknowledging what had happened, without ever admitting they'd used me, dismissed me, treated me like I was disposable. I asked them point blank what they thought I should apologize for, and this time I wanted specifics. Chris leaned back in his chair, his confidence fully restored now. He said I should apologize for being selfish, for prioritizing money over his happiness, for not being willing to go the extra mile for family. Melissa finally spoke up, her voice soft but pointed. She said in her family, siblings supported each other unconditionally. That when her sister got married everyone pitched in without complaining. That's just what you did when you loved someone. I felt something cold settle in my chest. These people, my own family, genuinely believed I was the selfish one. They genuinely thought I'd failed them. There was no reaching them, no explaining, no hoping they'd suddenly see things clearly. They were committed to their version of reality, and in that version I was the villain. I asked one more question. I asked if any of them, even one, thought maybe Chris's demands had been unreasonable. Maybe asking for imported orchids and opera singers and celebrity chefs when we had a set budget was excessive. Maybe expecting me to fund half a wedding, and then criticizing every choice I made was unfair. Maybe treating me like incompetent help instead of family was wrong. Nobody answered. Trish looked at Robert. Robert looked at his plate. Chris rolled his eyes. Melissa examined her fingernails. The silence stretched out, filling the room with its weight. And in that silence, I understood with perfect clarity that I was alone. I'd always been alone in this family. They were a unit of 4. And I was the outsider they tolerated as long as I was useful. The moment I stopped being useful, stopped sacrificing, stopped bending to their will, I became the problem that needed to be fixed or dismissed. I stood up from the table. My chair scraped against the floor, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Trish asked where I was going. We hadn't finished dinner. I picked up my purse from where I'd hung it on the back of my chair. I looked at each of them in turn, really looked at them, trying to memorize their faces because I knew something had fundamentally changed and nothing would be the same after this moment. Then I spoke, and my voice was steady and calm in a way that surprised even me. I told them I wouldn't be apologizing because I had nothing to apologize for. I said I'd given this family everything I had for years, my time, my money, my career opportunities, my emotional energy, and all I'd gotten in return was criticism and dismissal. I said I'd tried to make Chris's wedding beautiful within the budget we'd set, and instead of appreciation I'd been treated like an incompetent vendor. I said they could have their wedding and their perfect day, but they'd have it without me. Chris's face went red. He said I was being ridiculous, that I was throwing a tantrum like a child. I said I was done being treated like a child who needed to earn her place at the table. Trish stood up, her voice rising. She said I was being ungrateful, that they'd always supported me, always been there for me, that this attitude was hurtful and uncalled for. I asked her when exactly they'd supported me. When they handed the restaurant to Chris after I'd saved it. When they told me to be more flexible about wedding demands I couldn't afford. When they called me selfish for having boundaries. She didn't answer, just stared at me with this expression of shock, like she couldn't believe I was talking back. Robert said I was upset and not thinking clearly, that I should sleep on it and we'd talk in the morning when everyone was calmer. But I was thinking clearly. Maybe for the first time in years I was seeing the situation exactly as it was. I told them I wouldn't be at the wedding tomorrow. I said they'd made it clear over and over that I wasn't valued, that my presence was more of an obligation than a desire, that they'd be happier without me there anyway. Chris stood up fast enough that his chair nearly tipped over. He said I was being spiteful, that I was trying to ruin his day out of jealousy. I said I wasn't trying to ruin anything. I was simply choosing not to participate in an event where I wasn't wanted or respected. Melissa finally spoke up, her voice trembling. She said this was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives, that my absence would cast a shadow over everything, that people would ask questions and judge them. I said maybe they should have thought about that before spending months treating me like garbage. Maybe they should have considered that actions have consequences. Maybe they should have valued me when they had the chance. Trish's voice went cold then, colder than I'd ever heard it. She said if I walked out that door, if I refused to come to the wedding, then I was choosing to walk out of this family forever. The words hung in the air like a threat, like she was giving me an ultimatum, expecting me to back down, to apologize, to fall in line like I always had. But something had broken in me. That invisible chain that had kept me tethered to their approval, to their expectations, to the hope that someday they'd see me and love me the way they loved Chris, it had finally snapped. I looked at Trish and said that was fine with me. If being part of this family meant accepting disrespect and dismissal, if it meant sacrificing myself over and over for people who would never appreciate it, then I didn't want to be part of it anymore. Robert tried to interject, his voice reasonable and measured, saying we were all saying things we didn't mean, that family was forever, that we needed to calm down and work through this. But I was calm. Calmer than I'd been in months. I told him I meant every word. Chris said I was being dramatic and manipulative, that I was trying to make his wedding about me instead of about him and Melissa. I said his wedding had always been about him, that everything in this family had always been about him, and I was tired of disappearing into the background so he could shine. Trish said something then that I'll never forget. She said that maybe it would be better if I wasn't at the wedding. Maybe my negative energy and bitter attitude would bring down the whole celebration. Maybe the best gift I could give Chris and Melissa was my absence. Maybe everyone would be happier if I just disappeared from their lives entirely. She said it with such conviction, such certainty, like she'd been thinking it for a while and was only now giving herself permission to say it out loud. Robert didn't contradict her. Chris nodded in agreement. Melissa looked uncomfortable but said nothing to defend me. I felt something crack inside my chest, Not my heart breaking because that implies there was still something whole to break, but more like the final piece of foundation crumbling away. The piece I'd been standing on, hoping that underneath all the dysfunction there was still love, still family, still the possibility of being seen and valued. That piece was gone now. I was standing in empty air, and surprisingly it didn't feel like falling. Felt like floating free. I told them they'd get their wish. I said I wouldn't be at the wedding, wouldn't be at family dinners, wouldn't be available for the next crisis when they needed someone to clean up their messes. I said they could have their perfect family of 4, and I'd build a life without them. Chris actually laughed and said good luck with that I'd come crawling back within a month when I realized how alone I was. I said I'd rather be alone than be with people who made me feel invisible. I walked toward the door. Trish called after me, saying I was making a huge mistake, that I'd regret this, that family was everything and I was throwing it away over nothing. I turned back one last time. I said family should be everything, but this wasn't family, this was a hierarchy where I'd always been at the bottom. I said I'd spent years trying to earn a place I should have had by birthright and I was done trying. Then I walked out, closing the door behind me with a quiet click that felt louder than a slam would have. I sat in my car in their driveway, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my breath coming fast. Part of me expected someone to follow me out, to apologize, to ask me to come back and talk things through. But nobody came. The front door stayed closed. The warm light glowed through the windows, and inside my family was probably already moving on, probably already spinning the narrative about difficult Victoria and her dramatic exit. I started the engine and drove away, watching their house shrink in my rearview mirror until it disappeared entirely. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the dinner over and over. The things they'd said. The things I'd said. The finality of it all. Part of me felt guilty, wondering if I'd overreacted, if I should have tried harder to make them understand. But mostly I felt relieved. Exhausted and sad and angry. Yes, but underneath it all was this unexpected sense of relief. Like I'd been holding my breath for years and finally let it out. I didn't have to try anymore. I didn't have to hope anymore. I didn't have to keep sacrificing myself for people who would never see my value. That realization was painful and liberating at the same time. The next morning was the wedding day. I woke up early, the autumn sun streaming through my bedroom window, and for a moment I forgot what day it was. Then it hit me. Chris was getting married today. The wedding I'd spent months planning, the wedding I'd invested $12,000 in, the wedding I'd been uninvited from by my own family. I checked my phone out of habit. There were no messages, no calls, no last-minute apologies or pleas for me to reconsider. Just silence. They'd meant what they said. They wanted me gone. I made coffee and sat on my couch, trying to figure out what to do with myself. The wedding ceremony was at 2 in the afternoon at the Ivory Room, followed by a reception that would probably go until midnight. I could stay home, order takeout, watch movies, pretend it wasn't happening. But somehow that felt like letting them win, like hiding in shame when I had nothing to be ashamed of. So instead I called Ethan. He answered on the second ring, his voice concerned. He asked if I was okay, said he'd been worried about me after the family dinner. I told him what had happened, the whole story, and when I finished he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he was proud of me. He said it took courage to walk away from family, even toxic family, that most people stayed trapped in those dynamics forever. He asked what I was doing today. I said I had no idea. He said he had a better idea. He said there was a hiking trail about an hour outside Columbus, Hocking Hills with waterfalls and caves and incredible views. He said we should go, get out of the city, spend the day in nature instead of sitting around thinking about the wedding. I agreed immediately. It felt right, claiming this day for myself instead of dwelling on what I was missing. We drove out to Hocking Hills in Ethan's car, windows down, music playing, the late September air cool and perfect. The leaves were just starting to turn, hints of red and gold among the green. We hiked for hours, following trails that wound through forests and along rock formations that looked ancient and permanent. We climbed down wooden staircases to see waterfalls cascading into pools below. We sat on rocks and ate sandwiches we'd picked up at a gas station. We talked about everything except my family, and in those hours I felt more at peace than I had in months. At one point, sitting on a cliff overlooking a valley painted in early fall colors, Ethan asked me what I was going to do now. I said I didn't know exactly, but I knew I couldn't stay in Columbus. The city felt too small suddenly, too connected to my family, too full of memories and obligations. I said I'd been thinking about moving somewhere new, starting completely fresh where nobody knew me or my history. Ethan asked where I'd go. I said I'd always been drawn to Portland, Oregon. I'd visited once for a design conference a few years back and fallen in love with the creativity of the city, the coffee shops and independent bookstores, and the mountains visible from downtown. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. He said it sounded perfect for me, that I should do it, that nothing was holding me here anymore. He was right. Nothing was holding me here. My family had made it clear I wasn't wanted. I had no serious romantic relationship, no apartment lease that couldn't be broken, no job tying me to Columbus. My whole life was portable, everything important to me fit in my laptop and a couple suitcases. Why not leave? Why not start over somewhere nobody would look at me and see the disappointment daughter, the lesser sibling, the one who never quite measured up? I could be anyone in Portland. I could build a life based on who I actually was, not who my family had decided I was. By the time we drove back to Columbus, the sun was setting and the wedding was probably wrapping up. I wondered how it had gone. Whether the new planner had managed to pull everything together. Whether the imported orchids had materialized. Whether anyone had asked where I was. Whether Chris and Melissa had enjoyed their perfect day unmarred by my negative energy. But I didn't wonder for long. It wasn't my problem anymore. It wasn't my responsibility. It wasn't my family. Not really. Not in any way that mattered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.